The morning they came to take everything Alberta Shepard owned. She was standing in her kitchen making biscuits with flour she had ground herself from the last of the winter wheat. And she did not cry, not even when the tall man with the silver badge pinned to his coat read the figures aloud from a folded piece of paper, as though numbers on a page were the same thing as justice. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat on the edge of the cattle trail like a man who had built his house too close to the river and kept being surprised when the flood came. Caldwell was a rough-edged place, full of drovers and gamblers and men who had come west to become something different from whatever they had been before, and it smelled like livestock and river mud, and the particular kind of ambition that has not yet figured out what it wants. Alberta had lived there for 3 years, having arrived as a bride of 22 on the arm of Franklin Shepard, who had been handsome in a careless way and full of promises that turned out to be the architectural equivalent of buildings made entirely of words. Franklin was dead now. He had been dead for 7 months, which meant that Alberta had spent 7 months learning exactly how much he had owed to how many different people, and the number kept growing the way a wound grows when you do not treat it properly. There was the debt to Marcus Hale at the bank, which was the largest and the one that sat on the deed to the small house and the quarter-acre behind it. There was the debt to a cattle broker named Simmons, who had fronted Franklin money for a herd that had never materialized. There was the debt to the general store, which Alberta had known about and had been slowly paying down herself in the months since Franklin's passing. And there were others, smaller ones, the kind of debts that men accumulate the way they accumulate habits, without ever quite meaning to, but without ever quite stopping either. The man with the badge was named Deputy Colton, and he was not a cruel man. Alberta could see that. He was simply a man doing a job, which sometimes amounts to the same thing as cruelty, even when that is not the intent. Behind him stood Marcus Hale himself, who was a tall, cold-eyed man of 50 who wore his authority the way other men wore good coats, as something purchased and maintained. He had given Franklin the loan because Franklin had charm and Franklin had swaggered into his bank office with the confidence of a man who expected the world to arrange itself around his convenience, and for a while the world had obliged him in this, right up until it stopped. "Mrs. Shepard," Deputy Colton said, holding his hat in his hands with a sort of apologetic helplessness, "I am sorry to be the one doing this." "Are you?" Alberta said, not as a question. She set down the biscuit she had been pressing and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the figures on the paper he was holding out toward her. Marcus Hale stepped forward, and there was no hat holding in his posture. "The total outstanding against your husband's name, which is now your name by law and by custom, comes to $412. We have extended every courtesy available to us in the time since Franklin Shepard's passing. The bank's position is now that the debt must be settled or the property must be surrendered." $412, Alberta said. "That is the figure." She looked around her kitchen, at the cast iron stove that she had cleaned every morning of 3 years, at the window she had hung calico curtains in because the light came through hard in the afternoons and made it difficult to read, at the small table where she had eaten alone for 7 months and before that had eaten with a man who was mostly absent even when he was present. She thought about the fact that she had not made the debts. She had not been consulted about the loans. She had not signed any paper. She had simply married Franklin Shepard and inherited not only his name but the full architectural ruin of his financial life, and now the law stood in her kitchen and told her that the ruin was hers. "I will need until the end of the week," she said. Hale looked at Colton, and something passed between them that Alberta did not like the shape of. "You may have until Friday," Hale said, and there was a quality in his voice that told her he expected her to spend that time accepting the inevitable rather than looking for a way out of it. They left. Alberta stood in the kitchen for a long moment after the sound of their horses had faded, and then she sat down at the small table and put her face in her flour-dusted hands, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of something that was not quite crying but was adjacent to it, a kind of internal reckoning that used the same muscles. Then she stood up, took off her apron, put on her coat, and went out into the street. Caldwell in the spring was full of noise and movement. The cattle season was beginning to build toward its summer peak, and the drovers were starting to come through on the long trail up from Texas. Lean, sunburned men on horses that looked like they had walked every mile of the distance between there and here. The main street was wide and rutted with the evidence of wagon traffic, and the wooden buildings on either side wore their signs with the slightly desperate cheerfulness of places that needed to attract customers in order to survive. Alberta did not know precisely where she was going. She walked past the general store, where she owed money, and past the feed merchant, and past the place where a man played a fiddle outside a saloon every afternoon whether or not anyone was listening, and she was trying to construct in her mind some arrangement of the facts that would produce a solution when she nearly walked directly into a horse. The horse was a large gray animal of obvious quality, and it stopped when Alberta stopped, and the man on its back looked down at her with an expression of surprise that was almost immediately replaced with concern. He dismounted before she could speak, which was itself an interesting thing, because most men in Caldwell did not dismount when they nearly ran a woman down. They usually said something from the height of their saddle and kept moving. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he said. He was perhaps 28 or 29, tall in the way that comes from genuine height rather than from good boots, with dark hair that needed cutting, and the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor work into something honest-looking without being harsh. He was dressed simply, in a good canvas coat and plain trousers, with a hat that had seen considerable use. He had dark eyes that were looking at her with a directness that she was not, in her current state of mind, entirely prepared for. "I am fine," she said. "I was not watching where I was going. That is my fault entirely." "No harm done," he said, and he smiled, which changed his face in a way that she noticed without meaning to. "Peter Watkins," he said, and offered his hand. She shook it because she was too distracted to do anything else. "Alberta Shepard," she said. Something shifted in his expression when she said the name. He looked at her more carefully, not in an offensive way, but in the way of someone who has just recognized a context. "Franklin Shepard's widow," he said, and it was not quite a question. "Yes," she said, and the word came out flatter than she intended. "I heard about your husband," he said. "I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said, and then because something in his tone suggested that he meant more than the usual courtesy, she looked at him again. "Did you know him?" "I knew of him," Peter said carefully, which was a distinction that Alberta recognized as meaningful. "I have been in Caldwell about a week. I have a cattle broker's arrangement with a man named Simmons, and Franklin Shepard's name came up in that conversation in a way that I did not like the shape of." Alberta felt something cold move through her. "Simmons is one of the people to whom Franklin owed money." "I know," Peter said. "And I know that Simmons has been suggesting that since the debt passed to you along with the name, you might settle it in ways that have nothing to do with currency." He said this quietly and with a controlled anger that was interesting to watch, because it was clearly directed at Simmons and not at her. "I want you to know that I told Simmons exactly what I thought of that suggestion, and I am no longer doing business with him." Alberta looked at this man standing on the street in Caldwell with his gray horse and his plain coat, and his apparently principled objection to the idea that a woman should pay her dead husband's debts with anything other than money if she chose to pay them at all, and she did not know what to make of him. Men who arrived at moral positions about the treatment of women they did not know were either genuine or working an angle, and she had spent enough years married to a charming man to have become cautious about which category a given man fell into. "That is kind of you," she said neutrally. "It is not kindness," he said, also neutrally. "It is a basic position about what is right." He paused. "Mrs. Shepard, I do not want to intrude on your difficulties, but you have the look of a woman who has just received bad news, And Simmons is not the only person in this town who has ideas about how your situation might be resolved to his benefit rather than yours. If there is anything I can do that would be useful, I would genuinely like to offer it." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Are you in Caldwell for long?" she asked. "That depends," he said, "on whether there is reason to stay." It was not said with any particular implication, just a plain statement about an undecided situation, but it landed in her chest with a small, surprising weight. "I have a meeting with Marcus Hale at the bank on Friday," she said. "I am trying to determine whether there is any arrangement that can be made short of surrendering my house. I do not know much about the business of cattle or loans, or what a man who had Franklin's debts and needed to resolve them might be able to negotiate." Peter looked at her steadily. "I know something about all three of those things," he said. "I would be willing to sit down with you and go over what you have, and what you owe, and what your options are, if you would find that useful." She made a decision the way she had learned to make decisions in the 7 months since Franklin died, quickly and without the luxury of extensive deliberation. "Yes," she said, "I would find that useful." They arranged to meet at the hotel dining room the following morning, because it was a public place and Alberta had learned that public places were important when you were a widow and men had been making suggestions about your situation that had nothing to do with currency. Peter Watkins did not seem offended by this, which itself was another point in his favor. Alberta went home and sat at her small table and went through the papers she had kept in the tin box under the floorboard of the bedroom, the same floorboard that Franklin had not known about because Franklin had not been the kind of man who looked for things hidden under floorboards. She had the deed to the house. She had the loan papers from the bank, which she read carefully now for the first time, because when Franklin had been alive there had always been a reason why she did not need to read them, and after he died she had been too overwhelmed by the immediate weight of grief, and then the immediate weight of debt to sit down and truly understand the documents. She read them now. She read them 3 times, and by the third reading she had identified something that she thought might be significant, though she did not have enough knowledge of how these things worked to be certain. The loan had been made to Franklin Shepard, individually and by name. There was no clause she could find that automatically extended the obligation to his wife in the event of his death. The bank had been collecting on the assertion that the debt came with the name when a woman married, which was certainly the social expectation and possibly the legal one. But Alberta was no longer certain it was as airtight as Marcus Hale had presented it. She slept poorly that night, but she slept with the papers in the tin box within arm's reach, which was more than she had managed in recent weeks. The hotel dining room the next morning was half full with the breakfast crowd, men in from the trail and the occasional family passing through, and Peter Watkins was already seated at a corner table with a cup of coffee and an expression of focused attention that she found, walking toward him, unexpectedly reassuring. He stood when she approached, which was also a thing that fewer men did than should have. "Mrs. Shepard," he said, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for meeting me," she said, and sat down, and laid the tin box on the table between them. They spent 2 hours going through the papers. Peter was methodical and thorough in a way that surprised her, because cattle brokers were not always men of careful paperwork, but he had clearly done business that required him to understand contracts and the fine points of what obligations were legally binding and what were socially expected but not strictly enforceable. He read the bank loan papers with the particular attention of someone looking for the same thing she had found, and when he reached the relevant section, he was quiet for a moment. "This loan was made to Franklin Shepard as an individual," he said. "Yes," she said. "There is no signature from you. There is no clause that I can find that extends the obligation by default to a surviving spouse." "No," she said. "I could not find one either." He looked at her over the paper, and something in his expression was careful and honest in equal measure. "Mrs. Shepard, I am not a lawyer, and what I am about to say should be confirmed by one. But from what I can read here, the bank's position that you personally owe this debt may not be as legally solid as Marcus Hale has been presenting it. The property may be at risk if it was pledged as collateral, but whether the debt itself can be collected from you personally is a different question. Alberta felt something loosen slightly in the region of her sternum. The property was pledged, she said, pointing to the relevant line. Yes, so the house is at risk regardless. He set the paper down. But there is a difference between the house being collateral for a debt that was Franklin's and you personally owing $412 as if the debt was yours. One is about property. The other is about your name and your labor and your future. He said I owed both, she said. He said I owed the debt and the house both. He said that, Peter agreed. That does not make it true. Something in the simple directness of that statement hit her harder than she expected. She had been told so many things in the past 7 months by men with authority, by Deputy Colton and Marcus Hale and the cattle broker Simmons, and the men from the general store and the man from the feed merchant, all of them speaking with the assurance of people who expected their statements to be accepted as settled fact. And she had been so deep in grief and exhaustion and the sheer logistical catastrophe of Franklin's passing that she had not always stopped to ask whether the things she was being told were actually true or simply asserted with confidence. I need a lawyer, she said. You do, he agreed. There is one in Caldwell, a man named Abbott who I am told is competent. I can make inquiries this morning about his availability if you would like. Why are you doing this? She asked, and it came out more directly than she intended, but she was past the point of managing how things came out. You do not know me. You were in Caldwell a week and I nearly walked into your horse, and now you are spending your morning going through the legal papers of a woman you have no obligation to. Peter looked at her for a moment before answering, and she had the impression that he was choosing his words with genuine care rather than looking for the most effective ones. I had a mother, he said, who was left with debts that were not hers when my father died. I was 14. I watched her lose things that she had worked for because no one told her she had the right to ask questions, and the men who benefited from her not knowing that were not troubled by their consciences. I am 30 years old now, and I can do something that I could not do at 14, which is be present when a similar thing is happening and actually be useful. He paused. That is the honest answer. Alberta looked at him across the tin box and the scattered papers and the remains of their coffee, and thought that if this was an angle, it was a remarkably well-constructed one. But it did not feel like an angle. It felt like the truth, said plainly by a man who was accustomed to saying things plainly. All right, she said. Yes, if you would make inquiries about Abbott, I would be grateful. The lawyer Abbott was a dry, precise man of 55 who practiced out of a small office above the milliner's shop, and who had the manner of someone who had spent so long dealing with the human capacity for making contractual messes that he had become philosophically serene about it. He read the bank papers with the speed of a man who had read many such papers, asked Alberta several sharp questions, and then sat back in his chair and looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. Mrs. Shepard, he said, the bank does not have a clear personal claim against you for the debt itself. They have collateral against the property, yes, and the property is at genuine risk. But the personal debt is Franklin Shepard's, and Franklin Shepard is dead. Their strategy has been to leverage the social expectation that a wife's name means a wife's obligation, without actually having the legal documents to support that position. Can they take the house? Alberta asked. They can pursue the collateral claim, Abbott said. That is in the document and it is binding. Whether they would prevail is a question of what the property is worth against the debt and what a court would determine. He looked at her over his spectacles. I would recommend a proposal to the bank. Not full payment, which you clearly do not have, but a structured arrangement to pay down the property debt specifically, which is what is actually binding, while formally disputing the personal debt obligation. What would that require? Peter asked. He had come with her, having made clear he would be available if she found it useful and not intrusive, and she had found that she did. Abbott named a figure for an initial payment that would demonstrate good faith and halt the immediate proceedings. It was $80. Alberta looked at the figure and felt the particular weight of it, because $80 was more than she currently had by a distance that was itself discouraging. Outside Abbott's office, standing on the narrow wooden walkway above the street, Peter Watkins looked at her and said, "I have $80. Alberta turned to look at him. "No," she said immediately. "It is not charity," he said, with a slight edge that was not unkind. "It is a loan, if you prefer, with terms you determine, paid back whenever you are able, or consider it an investment in a property dispute that I believe you will win on the merits." He paused. "Or consider it the act of a man who is standing here on a Tuesday morning in Caldwell and has $80 and a very clear opinion about what should happen to it." "Peter," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. "I cannot take money from a man I have known for 1 day." "Then take it from a man you have known for 2 days," he said, and there was something in the slight smile that accompanied this that made it very difficult to maintain the position she was trying to maintain. "I am not going anywhere in particular, Mrs. Shepard. I told you that yesterday. I told you it depended on whether there was reason to stay." She looked at him for a long moment. There on the walkway above the Caldwell Street, with the spring sun coming down through the still thin air, and the sound of the town going about its Tuesday business around them. She was 25 years old, and she had been managing alone for 7 months, and she was tired in a way that went below her bones. And this man who had appeared as she walked distractedly into the path of his horse was looking at her with a directness and a sincerity that she did not know what to do with. "You would be a fool to stay in Caldwell for a widow's property dispute," she said. "Probably," he agreed, easily. "And $80 is a great deal of money." "It is," he said, "and I have worked hard for it, and I would rather spend it on this than on most other things I can think of." She made a decision. "A loan," she said, "formal terms. I will pay you back with interest at the rate Abbott considers fair, and I will sign a paper to that effect." "If it would make you more comfortable, yes," he said. "It would," she said. "Then that is what we will do," he said, and the simplicity of it, the unadorned willingness of it, hit her somewhere she had not expected to be hit. They went back to Abbott, who drafted a brief loan agreement between Alberta Shepard and Peter Watkins, terms clear and fair, interest modest, which Abbott himself witnessed. Then Peter went to the bank and deposited $80 against the property debt, while Abbott sent a formal letter to Marcus Hale disputing the personal debt obligation and citing the specific terms of the original loan document. Marcus Hale received this information on a Wednesday afternoon and was, by all accounts from the teller who witnessed it, not pleased. He spent Thursday having his own lawyer review the papers, and on Friday morning, instead of the confrontation Alberta had been dreading, she received a letter from the bank stating that pending further review, the foreclosure proceedings against the property were temporarily suspended, and that the question of the personal debt would require additional legal determination. Alberta sat at her small table and read that letter 4 times. Then she put it in the tin box, and put the tin box back under the floorboard and stood up and went out to find Peter Watkins, because she wanted to tell someone, and she had realized, standing in her kitchen, that the person she wanted to tell was him. She found him at the livery stable, where he was brushing down the gray horse with the focused attention he seemed to bring to everything. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face, the way it changed when he saw her, the way the attention sharpened and softened at the same time, was something she let herself notice without pushing it away. "The bank backed down," she said. He set down the brush and looked at her. "Temporarily," he said, being careful. "Temporarily," she agreed. "But it is something." She paused. "It is a great deal, actually. It is the first thing that has gone in any direction other than directly against me in 7 months." He walked toward her, stopping at a respectful distance, and the afternoon light coming through the livery's open door fell across his face in a way that she was going to think about later. "Then it is a good day," he said. "It is the best day I have had in a long time," she said, and the honesty of that surprised her, because she had been guarding her honesty with the same energy she had been guarding everything else. She looked at him and said, "Thank you, Peter." He looked back at her and said, "Alberta," and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it had the quality of something careful being set down gently. They stood in the livery in the warm late afternoon with the horse moving behind them and the sounds of Caldwell going on outside, and Alberta felt, for the first time since Franklin had died, something other than the grinding weight of everything, something lighter and more complicated and considerably more frightening. "I should go home and make supper," she said, which was not what she wanted to say but was what she said. "Of course," he said. "Would you—" She stopped, started again. "Would you like to come for supper? I owe you that much for the day's work." He looked at her with the steady dark eyes that she was already finding difficult to look away from. "Yes," he said. "I would like that very much." It was a simple meal, beans and cornbread and dried apple preserves that she had put up the previous autumn, the kind of food that required no apology in a working household, and Peter ate it with evident appreciation and did not pretend otherwise. They sat at the small table and talked, which was something that had not happened at that table for a long time in the way that it happened now, easily and with genuine curiosity on both sides. She learned that he was from Missouri originally, from a farm outside Springfield, and that he had come west at 18 after his father died, and the farm had gone to his older brother by the arrangements that were made when no one asked for his opinion about arrangements. He had driven cattle for 3 years and then transitioned into brokering, which suited him better because he was, as he said without particular vanity, better at the business side of things than the physical side, though the physical side had not exactly defeated him. He had traveled considerably in the decade since he left Missouri, through Texas and into New Mexico territory and up through Colorado and now into Kansas, and he carried this travel lightly, without the slightly aggressive pride that some men took in the distance they had covered. She told him things she had not told most people. She told him about the reality of her marriage, which had been neither terrible nor good, but had been characterized by a fundamental mismatch between what she had hoped for and what Franklin had actually been capable of providing, not financially, though that too, but in terms of presence and attention and the basic business of building a life together. She told him this carefully and without bitterness, because 7 months had given her some distance on it, and also because she was not a bitter person by nature, though she had been given sufficient material to work with. Peter listened in the way that she was coming to think of as characteristic of him, fully and without the impatience that men often showed when a woman spoke at length about something complicated. "Did you love him?" he asked, and it was not a presumptuous question the way he asked it but a genuine one. She considered it honestly. "I thought I did," she said. "When I married him, I thought I did. And I cared about him in the way that you care about someone you have lived alongside, but love the way that." She stopped. "I think I married because I was 22 and there was pressure, and he was charming, and it seemed like the thing to do, and I think I spent 3 years working very hard to make that decision into a better one than it actually was." "That is an honest thing to say," he said quietly. "You asked an honest question," she said. He looked down at his hands on the table and then back up at her. "I have never married," he said. "I came close once 5 years ago. A woman in Texas named Clara who was sharp and funny and practical, and who eventually decided that a man who moved around as much as I did was not a man she could build anything with. She was right. I was not ready to stop moving." He paused. "I think I have been waiting to find a reason to stop." The sentence sat between them with a weight and a warmth that Alberta felt in her face and in her hands. She looked at her dried apple preserves and said, carefully, "That is also an honest thing to say." "You asked an honest question," he said, and when she looked up he was smiling, and she found herself smiling back, which was the first time in so long that the muscles required for it felt slightly unfamiliar. He left after supper, walking back through the Caldwell night to the hotel, and Alberta sat at her cleared table for a while in the lamplight and thought about the fact that she had met this man 2 days ago. 2 days ago she had nearly walked into his horse. And now her table felt more full with him absent from it than it had felt in months when it was simply empty. She went to bed and slept better than she had since Franklin died. The following weeks had the quality of something building. Peter stayed in Caldwell, which ceased to be surprising and became simply a fact. He had set up a modest business arrangement with a cattle drover named Hendricks, who was in need of a reliable broker, and was pleased to have found one. And this gave him legitimate business in the area that had nothing to do with Alberta, which she appreciated, because it meant that he was not simply constructing reasons to be present, but was actually present in his own right. He came to supper twice more in that first week, and they fell into an easy rhythm of conversation that Alberta found she looked forward to with an urgency that she recognized as significant and was still not entirely sure what to do with. She had been a widow for 7 months. She had been managing everything alone. The social arithmetic of how quickly a widow could reasonably develop feelings for a new person was something she was aware of, and she was aware that other people were also aware of it, because Caldwell was a small town, and small towns are deeply attentive to the romantic situations of their inhabitants. Mrs. Hargrove, who ran the boarding house 2 streets over, and who had appointed herself the town's leading authority on appropriate social conduct, made a point of mentioning to Alberta at the dry goods store that she had seen Alberta walking with a gentleman on 2 separate occasions, and that she hoped Alberta was taking appropriate care. Alberta thanked her in a tone of voice that Mrs. Hargrove correctly identified as not entirely grateful and moved on. What she and Peter had in those weeks was something she did not have a simple name for. They talked. They sat at her table and walked together along the river path outside of town in the evenings when the weather was mild, and they talked about everything, about cattle markets and legal systems, and the nature of the West and what they wanted from their lives and what they had found and what they had not found. He told her about Missouri, and she told him about Ohio, where she had grown up before her family had come west. He made her laugh regularly, which was not a skill she had expected from a man of his particular serious-seeming nature, but the humor was dry and observational and suited her well, and the legal situation continued to develop. Abbott corresponded with the bank's lawyer and with Hale directly, and the position gradually became clear. The bank could pursue the property collateral through proper proceedings, which would be lengthy and expensive for both parties, or they could negotiate a settlement arrangement on the property debt specifically, with the personal debt claim effectively dropped. Hale did not like this, and made his displeasure known through his lawyer in language that was professionally restrained but emotionally transparent. The cattle broker Simmons was a separate and less pleasant matter. Simmons was owed $200 that Franklin had taken against a promised herd that had never materialized, and Simmons had not taken the route of the bank's lawyers, but had instead begun making himself unpleasant in personal ways that Alberta found more alarming than the legal proceedings. He came to her house on a Tuesday evening when she was inside alone, and stood on her porch and said things through the door that she did not choose to repeat to anyone, but that communicated clearly his position that the debt could be settled in non-monetary ways, and that he expected her to come around to this view. She did not open the door. She waited until he left, and then she sat in her kitchen and was angry in a way that was very clean and clear and pointed. The next morning she told Peter, because she had made a decision about Peter by that point, a quiet internal decision that was less about romance and more about trust, which was its own kind of romance if you thought about it correctly. She told him about Simmons's visit, and she watched his face go very still in a way she had not seen before. "Are you all right?" He asked first which was the right first question. Yes, she said. He stayed on the porch. He did not try to force his way in, but the intent was clear enough. Peter was quiet for a moment. Simmons is someone I already have a poor opinion of, he said. I ended our business arrangement partly because of the comments he made about you. This is worse. He looked at her. I would like to speak to him. I would rather you not on my behalf, she said, because she had thought about this and she meant it. I am capable of managing my own difficulties, and I do not want to become someone who needs a man to speak for her in order to be safe in her own home. He looked at her with an expression that she had come to think of as his careful listening face. That is a fair position, he said. What would you like to do? I would like to see Abbott today and find out what legal options exist for Simmons's claim specifically, she said, and I would like to know whether his conduct last night constitutes anything actionable. It might, Peter said. It might constitute intimidation at the very least. Abbott will know. They went to Abbott, who was, as usual, dry and precise and useful. He confirmed that Simmons's conduct could be characterized as intimidation, and that a formal complaint to Deputy Colton was available to Alberta if she chose to pursue it. He also reviewed the specifics of Simmons's debt claim and found it, upon examination, to be considerably less airtight than Simmons believed, because the arrangement between Simmons and Franklin had been largely verbal, and the written portion was ambiguous about what specifically had been promised in exchange for the advance. The written document does not specify a herd, Abbott said. It specifies an unspecified business venture. That is not the same thing. Simmons believes he is owed $200, Alberta said. Simmons may believe whatever he likes, Abbott said. What Simmons can prove in a legal proceeding is a different question. He looked at her. Do you wish to file the intimidation complaint? Yes, she said. She filed it that afternoon with Deputy Colton, who received it with the uncomfortable expression of a man who would have preferred not to be put in the position of taking a woman's complaint against a reasonably established business figure in his town, but who could not in good conscience refuse it. He sent word to Simmons, who did not come to her house again, and the complaint sat on record and had the useful effect of making Simmons's position in any subsequent legal discussion somewhat less comfortable than it had been. 2 weeks after that, Abbott reached a settlement with the bank. The property debt would be restructured over 3 years at a rate Alberta could manage with her earnings from the seamstress work she had been quietly building since Franklin's death, work she had not discussed with Hale or Simmons because she had not trusted them not to find a way to claim it. The personal debt was formally dropped. The house was hers, conditionally, and the condition was one she could meet with work and time. Alberta came home from Abbott's office that afternoon and stood in her kitchen and looked at the calico curtains and the cast iron stove and the small table and felt something that was not happiness exactly, but was the solid foundational floor beneath where happiness might eventually build. She had her house. She had her name, her actual name, not the debt and the obligation that had been attached to it like barnacles on a hull, but the name itself, clean and belonging to her. She had done this. With Abbott's help and Peter's loan and her own refusal to simply accept what she was told. Peter arrived that evening with a bottle of cider that he had acquired from somewhere, because it was May and the weather was warm, and they sat on her porch in the evening light and she told him the outcome, and his face did the thing she loved, which was that it showed everything he felt without performing anything. That is good news, he said, and the simplicity and sincerity of it was better than any more elaborate response could have been. It is the best news, she said. They sat in the quiet of the evening for a while, with the cider and the warm air and the sounds of Caldwell at a comfortable distance. The cattle season was well underway now, and the town had the busy, slightly reckless energy of its peak season, but out here on Alberta's porch it was quiet and still. I have been thinking, Peter said after a while. About what? She said. He looked at the horizon where the sun was going down in the colors that only Kansas evenings could produce, deep orange and rose and a particular shade of purple that always seemed improbable. About whether to stay, he said. She was quiet. Not about Caldwell specifically, he said. About whether I am the kind of person who can stay somewhere. He turned to look at her. I think I might be. I think I have found in the past several weeks that I am considerably more interested in a specific piece of ground than I have been in a long time. Caldwell is not the most obvious place to become attached to, she said carefully. No, he agreed. It is not Caldwell. The evening air between them had changed in quality, and they both knew it. Alberta looked at her hands on the porch railing and then looked at Peter, who was looking at her with the directness and honesty that she had come to trust more than she had trusted very many things. I am a widow of 7 months, she said, not as an objection but as a statement of relevant fact. I know, he said. I have debts being paid and a house that is conditionally mine and a seamstress business that is in its early stages and a general life situation that is not exactly settled. I know all of that, he said. I have been paying attention. I owe you $80, she said. You do not owe me anything, he said, and the sentence had a resonance that went past the money, because it was the same thing he had essentially said on the first day, that she did not owe the debts and she did not owe the name. He was saying it again in a different context, and it meant the same thing, that what passed between them should be free of obligation, that whatever she felt or chose should come from herself and not from any sense of what she owed. She looked at him for a long moment. The sun was nearly down. The sky was extraordinary. Peter, she said. Alberta, he said. If you are staying, she said, I want you to know that it is not because of the $80. I know, he said, and he smiled, and she thought about how his face had changed the first day she saw him, how the smile transformed it, and she thought about the fact that she had been collecting these moments. She had not meant to, but she had, the way he looked when he listened to something, the way he stood when he was thinking, the way he said her name with the particular care that suggested it was something he wanted to say carefully. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. His hand turned under hers and held it. They sat that way as the sky finished going down, and it was the most simple and the most significant thing that had happened on that porch, which was saying something because the porch had been the site of Simmons's unpleasantness, and this was a considerable improvement. I would like to court you properly, he said, if you would permit it. I would, she said. They did not rush it because Alberta would not have permitted rushing and Peter did not suggest it. The summer of 1878 was warm and busy, and they spent it learning each other in the way that two careful people learn each other, gradually and with attention. He came to supper regularly. They took the evening walks along the river. They attended church together on Sundays, which gave Mrs. Hargrove something to observe that was socially acceptable, and they occasionally attended the dances that the town organized in the summer months, though Peter confessed to a limited dancing ability that made Alberta laugh, and which he applied himself to improving with the same methodical seriousness he applied to everything. Her seamstress business grew through the summer. She had a natural talent for it, and Caldwell had no shortage of women who wanted good work done, and the drovers' wives who passed through on their way further west were occasionally in need of repairs or alterations, and word spread in the way that good work spreads. By August, she had more work than she could manage alone, and she hired a girl named Rosa, the 17-year-old daughter of a Mexican family who had settled outside of town and who was clever with a needle and glad of the income. With Rosa's help, the seamstress work began to produce enough income that Alberta made her first payment against the restructured property debt ahead of schedule, which she found deeply satisfying in a way that was almost physical, the sensation of chipping at something large and watching it diminish under the chisel of her own effort. The Simmons matter resolved itself in late July, when Simmons, apparently deciding that Caldwell had become less congenial than it had been, relocated his business to Wichita. Abbott sent a formal letter to his new address, noting that any future pursuit of the alleged debt would be contested on the grounds of the document's ambiguity, and Simmons did not respond, which was itself a kind of response. Peter told her about this on the evening she found out, and the relief she felt was not as large as she had expected, partly because the threat had diminished over the preceding months, and partly because the evening she was having was already good enough that the news about Simmons was simply one more positive element in an evening that was already full of them. They were sitting on the porch again. It had become their place, the porch in the evenings, and he had been telling her something funny about a negotiation gone wrong with a cattle drover who had overestimated the quality of his herd by a significant margin, and she had been laughing in the way she laughed with him, genuinely and without self-consciousness, and he had stopped talking and was simply looking at her with an expression that she knew by now. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. He stopped. He was not a man who stumbled over words usually, and the stumble was noticeable. "I was thinking that I have been looking for something for a long time without knowing precisely what it was, and I think it might be this." She looked at him in the late summer evening. "This," she said. "You," he said. "This, all of it. The porch and the cider and the business about Simmons and the legal papers and the whole complicated particular reality of your life, Alberta. I have not felt at home anywhere in a long time, and I feel it here." She looked at her hands for a moment and then looked at him. "I want to say something to you," she said, "and I want to say it carefully because I mean it carefully." She took a breath. "I think you are the most honest person I have ever known. Not honest as in merely truthful, though you are that, but honest as in, you are what you appear to be, and what you appear to be is someone who sees me, actually sees me, not what I owe or what I represent or what I might provide, but the actual person that I am, and that is—" She stopped, because her voice had done something unexpected. She steadied it. "That is not a thing I have had before, and I do not take it lightly." Peter was looking at her, with an expression that was open in a way that made her chest ache. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, gently, the way you handle something that matters, and then he kissed her, there on the porch in the late summer evening, which was exactly the right place and the right time and felt like something that had been building for the entire summer and had simply decided now was the moment. It was a soft kiss and a brief one, but it had the quality of something that intends to be the first of many, which it was. The summer turned to autumn, and the cattle drives wound down as the season changed, and Caldwell shifted back into its quieter off-season character. Peter's business with Hendricks was winding down naturally with the season, and he and Alberta had conversations about what came next that were increasingly practical, which was its own kind of romance, the practicality of two people who were building something together. He had some money saved. Not a great deal, but enough to be useful. She had the house, conditionally, and the seamstress business, and Rosa, who was becoming more skilled every week. Peter had spent the summer making connections with several ranchers in the area around Caldwell who were interested in a reliable broker for their cattle operations, and there was the shape of a sustainable local business in those connections if he stayed. In October, he asked her to marry him. He did it on the porch, because of course he did, their porch, the place that had become the geography of their particular story, and he was not dramatic about it, which suited her, but he was serious and warm, and he said things that were true. "I am not offering you rescue," he said, "because you do not need rescuing. You have demonstrated that comprehensively, and I have been proud to watch it. I am offering you a partnership. I am offering you someone to have supper with and to talk to and to sit on this porch with for a long time, and I am offering it because I am in love with you, Alberta, which is something I have not said to anyone in a very long time, and which I mean without reservation." She had been trying for several minutes not to cry, because she was not generally a person who cried, and she was not going to start now over something good, and she was having mixed success. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He put a ring on her finger that he had made by the jeweler in town, a simple gold band with a small piece of turquoise set into it that he had found in New Mexico years before and kept because he liked the color. And it was the most personal ring she could have imagined, not extravagant but thought about, chosen with genuine attention to the specific person receiving it, which was what she would have wanted. They were married in December of 1878, a small wedding in the church with Abbott and his wife and Hendricks, and his family and Rosa and her family, and a few others who had become part of their lives over the preceding months. Mrs. Hargrove attended and managed to appear both disapproving of the speed and genuinely moved by the ceremony, which was something of an achievement. The minister said words. Peter said his vows with the steadiness she had come to expect from him, looking at her directly and meaning every word. She said hers and meant every word. Afterward they had a supper at the hotel that was generous and warm and went on longer than strictly necessary, because no one was in a hurry to leave, which was itself a good sign. The first year of their marriage had the quality of something that exceeds expectation, not because it was without difficulty. The property debt was still being paid, and the business was still being built, and the world was not suddenly kind simply because two people had found each other, but because the difficulty was shared in a way that made it fundamentally different from difficulty born alone. Peter was good at the things she was not good at, and she was good at the things he was not good at, and they had long since established that neither of them was required to pretend otherwise. He moved into the house, which required some rearrangement and some adjustment, because a house that has been lived in alone develops particular habits, and incorporating another person requires negotiation, and they negotiated in good faith and with the humor that had been a feature of their relationship from the beginning. He reorganized the desk area in a way that she initially found confusing before discovering it was actually more efficient. She arranged the kitchen in a way that he initially could not navigate and which she refused to change because it worked. These were the ordinary human negotiations of a shared life, and they did it. In the spring of 1879, Alberta discovered she was expecting. She told Peter on the porch, which was where they told each other important things, and watched his face do the thing she never tired of watching it do, the open showing of exactly what he felt. "A baby," he said, and his voice was different in a way that was something more than simple happiness, something like wonder. "In the autumn," she said. He put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her forehead and then looked at her with the full attention that was one of the things she loved most about him. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I am pregnant," she said, "which is a different thing." "Both," he said. "You are both." Their son was born in October of 1879, which gave him an autumn birthday and the particular temperament that Alberta would always associate with that fact, a changeable, energetic quality like the season itself. They named him James after Peter's father and Edward after Alberta's grandfather, and he was a dark-haired, loud, opinionated infant who appeared to have opinions about everything from the first day and did not hesitate to share them. James changed everything and nothing. Everything in the immediate physical sense, because a baby is a substantial reorganization of the domestic world, and nothing in the essential sense, because what they had was solid enough to incorporate a new person without losing its own shape. The property debt was fully paid off in 1881, which was a year ahead of the schedule Abbott had established. Alberta paid the final amount to the bank on a Thursday morning and came home with the deed, fully cleared, and put it in the tin box under the floorboard. And that evening she told Peter, and they celebrated on the porch with the good whiskey he saved for significant occasions. "Franklin's debts," she said, looking at the cleared deed in her hands in the lamplight. "I was handed his debts along with his name and told I owed both, and I want to say to you that I think of those things now, the debts and the name, differently." "How so?" he said. "The name," she said. "I have it still, and I chose to keep it when we married not because I owed it but because it is mine now. It has been mine for years. I have filled it with things that have nothing to do with Franklin or what he left behind. The seamstress business and the house and the work and this." She gestured between them, at the porch, at the house where James was sleeping, at everything they had built. "It is my name, not his debts, my name. Peter looked at her with the expression she thought of as his most honest, the one where everything he felt was entirely visible. "Yes," he said simply. "And you," she said, "told me from the beginning that I did not owe the debts and I did not owe the name to anyone, and you were right. And I want you to know that I have thought about that every day since you said it, because it was the first true thing anyone said to me in a very long time." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side in the way she had over the past years developed as her natural resting position when they sat together, and they watched the Kansas evening go dark over the flat land that had been the geography of her hardest years, and had become, somehow, the geography of the best ones. The seamstress business continued to grow. By 1882, Rosa was effectively a partner rather than an employee, and Alberta had formalized this arrangement in a way that Rosa had not expected, and that made Rosa's mother cry briefly at the kitchen table where they signed the papers, which made Alberta think of herself sitting at Abbott's office years before, and feeling for the first time that the documents might go in her direction rather than against her. Rosa was 21 now, and had recently begun stepping out with a young man from the cattle operation, which Alberta found charming and chose not to comment on directly, except to make sure that Rosa knew she could talk about it if she wanted to, which Rosa eventually did, at considerable and enthusiastic length. Peter's brokering business had grown steadily. The railroad had come through the region and changed the cattle business in various ways, some of which were good for brokers, and some of which required adaptation, and Peter adapted, because he was the kind of person who looked at change as a practical matter rather than a personal affront. He had a reputation in the area now for fairness and competence, which he wore as lightly as he wore everything else but which was genuinely earned. They had a daughter in 1883, whom they named Clara, not after the woman in Texas, but after Alberta's mother, and the coincidence of the name made Peter smile the first time he said it and look at Alberta with an expression of fond amusement. Clara was nothing like James except in the family resemblance that showed in both of them, James being 4 years old by then and deeply interested in the new baby, in the particular combination of fascination and suspicion that older siblings show the younger. James at 4 was exactly what he had been at birth, opinionated and energetic and loud, and Alberta loved him with the full force of a love she had not known she was capable of until he existed. He had Peter's dark eyes and her stubbornness, which Peter said was the most natural combination imaginable, and he had already developed a habit of demanding explanations for things that adults did not usually explain to children, which Alberta thought was an excellent quality that she intended to encourage regardless of how inconvenient it made things sometimes. Clara was quieter and more observational, a baby who watched the world with a steady attention that Alberta thought, looking at her, she recognized. Peter said the same thing. They agreed that Clara would be trouble eventually in the best possible way. Life in Caldwell continued to evolve. The town was changing, the rough edges softening slightly as the cattle trade matured and more families settled, and the infrastructure of a more permanent community developed. There were more schools and churches, and less of the wild, transient quality that had characterized the town in 1878. It was still the West, and it was still hard, and the land was still indifferent to human plans. But the specific chaos of those early years had settled into something that required different kinds of strength than the strength required to keep your house when men stood in your kitchen with debt figures on folded papers. Alberta was 30 years old in 1883, the year Clara was born, and she stood one autumn evening on her porch with Peter beside her and James running through the yard in the fading light trying to catch something in the grass. And she thought about the woman she had been at 25 who had walked distractedly into the path of a gray horse on a Caldwell street and nearly not looked up. She had looked up. That was the thing, she thought. She had been in the worst stretch of her life, and she had been given her husband's debts along with his husband's name, and she had been told she owed both to everyone, And what had happened instead was that she had met a man on a Tuesday in May who told her she owed nothing, and she had chosen to believe him, and she had chosen to fight, and she had chosen eventually to love him, and all of those choices had been hers. The house was paid for. The deed was in the tin box. The seamstress business was Rose's and hers together, and it was real and growing. Peter's cattle business was established and honest. James was catching whatever he was catching in the yard. Clara was sleeping inside with a confidence that new babies have about their right to sleep wherever they wish. "What are you thinking about?" Peter said beside her, because after 5 years of marriage he had learned to read the particular quality of her silence that meant thinking. "The gray horse," she said. He laughed, which she loved, which she would always love. "The one you nearly walked into." "The one I nearly walked into," she agreed. "I was having quite possibly the worst morning of my life." "I know," he said. "You had the look." "What look?" "The look of someone who has been carrying too much for too long and has just been given more," he said. I recognized it because I had seen it before. He paused. "I recognized you before I knew you, if that makes any sense." "It makes perfect sense," she said. James appeared at the porch steps with something cupped in his dirty hands that turned out to be a very small and extremely unhappy toad, which he presented to his parents with the pride of a serious scientific discovery. Peter examined it with the appropriate solemnity and told James it appeared to be a fine specimen. Alberta told him to put it back where he found it before supper. James looked at the toad, apparently consulting its wishes, and then went back into the yard. "Fine specimen," Alberta said. "Of considerable character," Peter agreed. They stood on the porch in the October evening, and the sky was doing the thing Kansas skies did in October, putting on a display of color that seemed designed to remind you that the world was larger than your particular difficulties and more beautiful than your worst days. Alberta put her hand in Peter's, and he held it the way he had been holding it for 5 years, with attention and ease, the way you hold something you intend to keep. The mortgage on their house was paid. The debts were gone. The name was hers, and it meant her work and her children and this man and this porch and this evening. It meant everything she had built from the rubble of what she had been handed. She had owed nothing to anyone she had not chosen to owe it to, and she had chosen carefully, and the choosing had been the whole of it. Inside, Clara made a small sound of waking, and Alberta turned toward the door, and Peter said, "I have her," and went inside, which was also one of the things she loved, the way he simply went, without discussion or negotiation, because that was what needed doing and he was there to do it. She stood on the porch another moment in the evening, and listened to the sounds of her house, to Peter's voice inside talking quietly to their daughter in the particular gentle tone he used with the children, to James still pursuing something in the fading light, to the distant sounds of Caldwell settling into its evening routines, to the wind coming off the flat land that stretched away in all directions toward a horizon that was, in October, deeply beautiful. She had come to Kansas as a bride with hopes that had not been met. She had stayed as a widow with debts that had not been hers. She had stayed still and fought and built and been loved in return by someone who saw her clearly and valued what he saw. The evening deepened. James came to the porch steps with grass-stained knees and a cheerful report about the toad's successful return to its original location. Alberta told him to wash his hands. He went inside, passing his father in the doorway with Clara settled in the crook of his arm, and Peter stood in the doorway and looked at her with the expression she had been collecting for 5 years, the open, honest showing of everything. "Supper," he said. "Supper," she agreed. She went inside, into the warmth and the noise of her family, into the house that was hers, with a name that was hers, with a life that was entirely and completely her own. The years that followed settled into the good rhythm of a life well built. The winter of 1884 brought the kind of cold that tests the Kansas plains, and Peter and James, who was 5 by then and deeply serious about being helpful, spent mornings bringing in wood together, while Alberta managed the stove and Rosa came through town on her way to the shop bundled in the heavy coat Alberta had sewn for her the previous autumn. The shop itself had become a proper establishment by that point, with a proper sign above the door and 3 women working at any given time in the busy seasons, and Alberta's name on the papers meaning something in the town's commercial life, rather than simply appearing on debt documents. Marcus Hale had retired from the bank in 1882, a fact that Alberta received with a simple nod when Peter told her and did not elaborate on, because she did not wish to be a petty person and she had not been a petty person, but she was also human, and the nod contained multitudes. The new bank manager was a younger man named Morrison who had no history with any of the 1878 proceedings, and who dealt with Alberta and Peter on the straightforward basis of 2 established local business owners, which was entirely satisfactory. Deputy Colton had risen to marshal, which Alberta thought he was better suited to than deputy, because his discomfort with the enforcement of unjust proceedings was less professionally limiting as a marshal who set policy than as a deputy who implemented it. He came by the shop occasionally for his wife's alterations, and had the manner of a man who was quietly glad about how things had turned out, though they never discussed it directly. Rosa married her cattleman in the spring of 1884, a small wedding in her family's church outside of town that Alberta attended with Peter and both children, and she cried at it, which surprised her, not the crying but the reason for it, which was not sadness but the full-hearted recognition of something good. Rosa in her wedding dress looked happy in a way that was real and particular, and Alberta thought about standing in her own wedding dress in December of 1878, and how she had felt, which was also real and particular, and she squeezed Peter's hand and he looked at her and smiled, and she thought that 5 years had not diminished anything, had only deepened it. James started school in the autumn of 1884, and took to it with the same opinionated enthusiasm he took to everything, coming home with strong positions on mathematics and the behavior of his classmates. Clara, meanwhile, was 1 year old and walking with the determined confidence of someone who had decided the world needed to be covered quickly and was getting on with it. The house was full in the way that makes a house feel like itself rather than simply like shelter. In 1886, Alberta's mother came west from Ohio, a woman of 60 who had been widowed herself 3 years before and who had decided, in the brisk way she had always decided things, that she was not going to spend her remaining years in a house in Ohio that had become too quiet. She arrived by train and was collected at the station by Peter and both children, and Alberta stood on the platform and saw her mother step down from the car with her good traveling case and look around at the Kansas afternoon with an expression of determined assessment, and felt something open up in her chest. Peter had built a small addition to the house the previous year, a room off the back that had been intended as additional workshop space for Alberta's sewing, but which was now obviously intended for her mother. And when her mother saw it, she looked at Peter for a long moment and then said, "You are a good man," in the direct Ohio manner that Alberta recognized, and that clearly startled Peter slightly, which made Alberta extremely happy. Her mother's name was Margaret, and she became a presence in the household that was substantial in all the best ways, a woman who had strong opinions about baking and child-rearing and the conduct of daily life, and who applied these opinions with enough warmth that they were received as gifts rather than impositions. James adored her immediately and completely, which was mutual. Clara was wary of her for approximately 2 weeks and then equally adoring. Peter treated her with a combination of respect and genuine affection that made Alberta love him more than she had thought was still available, which was a thing she kept finding out, that there was always more. The summer of 1887 produced a 3rd child, another boy they named Thomas, who arrived with considerably less drama than James had, but with equal evidence of strong preferences about the world. 3 children and 1 grandmother and 2 businesses and 1 gray horse. now retired to a comfortable pasture situation outside of town, because Peter had refused to sell him even when he was past his working years. Because the gray horse had, in his view, made a significant contribution to the course of events and deserved accordingly comfortable retirement. Alberta brought this up occasionally as the kind of thing a wife is entitled to bring up, the keeping of a retired horse being a luxury that was not strictly necessary, and Peter's position was consistently that he was right and she was welcome to her opinion, delivered with enough affection that the argument was really a kind of affection itself. Thomas grew. Clara grew. James grew and started having opinions about ranching, which he investigated seriously at 9 years old by spending a summer following one of the neighboring ranchers around asking questions, an activity the rancher bore with more patience than most would have, and which resulted in James coming home with an extremely detailed understanding of cattle management that he would have been able to deploy professionally if he had been 30 rather than 9. Alberta turned 35 in 1888, and Peter marked the occasion with a dinner at the hotel with Margaret and Rosa's husband, and several others who had become part of their particular community over the decade. And he said things in his toast that she kept in her memory the way she had always kept the best things he said, precisely and without embellishment, because they did not require embellishment. "I want to say," he said, standing with his glass in the hotel dining room where they had once sat with her tin box of papers and gone through the legal documents of a life that was trying to swallow her whole, "that I am glad every day for a gray horse and an inattentive pedestrian." The table laughed. He looked at her. "And I am glad every day that you looked up." She had looked up. She had looked up and kept looking up, and the world she had found by doing so was here, at this table, with these people, in this town, in this life that she had built from the rubble of what she had been handed and refused. She had been given his debts and his name. She had not owed either. What she had built instead was entirely and irrevocably her own, and it was good, and it was real, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and she raised her glass and said so.